Guatemala, 1946. A small Central American country of extraordinary natural beauty and rich indigenous culture. A country that had just emerged from decades of dictatorship and was trying to build a better future for its people. A country whose citizens trusted that the powerful nation to the north, the United States of America, stood for freedom, dignity, and human rights. That trust was about to be catastrophically betrayed. Because in 1946, a team of American doctors and researchers arrived in Guatemala with a mission that had nothing to do with helping the Guatemalan people. They had come to use them, to infect them deliberately with deadly diseases without their knowledge or consent, to treat human beings as laboratory animals in the name of American medical research. And when they were done, they would pack up their equipment and go home, leaving behind hundreds of infected and dying people. And a secret so dark that it would stay buried for over 60 years. The experiments were organized by a doctor named John Charles Cutler, a researcher working for the United States Public Health Service, the same government agency that was simultaneously running the Tuskegee experiment on Black Americans back home in Alabama. Cutler arrived in Guatemala in 1946 with a specific mission. He wanted to test whether penicillin could prevent syphilis and gonorrhea after exposure to the diseases. It was a legitimate scientific question. But the way Cutler chose to answer it was anything but legitimate. Rather than conducting ethical research with informed volunteers, Cutler decided to deliberately infect human beings without their knowledge or consent. He chose his subjects carefully. People who had no power, no voice, no ability to refuse. Guatemalan prisoners, mental patients, soldiers, indigenous people who had even less protection than most. People who trusted the American doctors, who came to their institutions with their white coats and their professional smiles. People who had no idea what was really happening to them. The victims of the Guatemala experiments were among the most vulnerable people in Guatemalan society. Prisoners held in the national penitentiary who had no choice but to submit to whatever the authorities demanded of them. Patients in the National Mental Health Hospital who were incapable of giving informed consent to anything. Soldiers in the Guatemalan army who were ordered to participate by their superior officers. And orphaned children who were used in some of the experiments without any adult advocate to protect them. These were not volunteers. These were captive human beings who were at the complete mercy of their captors, and their captors handed them over to American researchers who proceeded to infect them with syphilis and gonorrhea using methods that were deliberately designed to ensure the infections took hold. Over 700 people were deliberately infected. And they were never told what had been done to them, never treated properly, never compensated, and never given the truth. The methods John Cutler used to infect his subjects were as disturbing as anything conducted under Project MK-Ultra or the Tuskegee experiment. He introduced syphilis bacteria directly into open wounds on the bodies of prisoners. He had infected prostitutes brought to the prison to have sexual contact with inmates. He injected syphilis directly into the spines of mental patients. He scraped the skin of subjects and applied infected material directly to the wounds. He used every method he could think of to ensure that the infections took hold as efficiently as possible. Some subjects were infected with both syphilis and gonorrhea simultaneously. Some were infected multiple times. The experiments were conducted with a cold clinical precision that revealed a complete disregard for the humanity of the people being used. These were not patients. They were not volunteers. They were test subjects, chosen because they had no power to say no. John Cutler and his colleagues knew that what they were doing was wrong. They knew it violated every principle of medical ethics. They knew that the experiments they were conducting in Guatemala would never have been permitted on American soil. In fact, at the same time, Cutler was infecting Guatemalans. In secret, the United States was participating in the Nuremberg trials, where Nazi doctors were being prosecuted for conducting medical experiments on concentration camp prisoners without their consent. The irony was breathtaking. America was prosecuting Germans for doing exactly what American doctors were simultaneously doing in Guatemala, and everyone involved knew it. The experiments were kept completely secret. Reports were written in deliberately vague language. Results were shared only within a small circle of trusted colleagues. The Guatemalan government officials who cooperated with the research were sworn to secrecy. And when the experiments ended in 1948, John Cutler packed up his files and went home, leaving behind his victims and his secrets, confident that nobody would ever find out. For over 60 years, the Guatemala experiments remained completely hidden. John Cutler went on to a distinguished career in American public health. He worked on the Tuskegee study for years. He received awards and honors. He died in 2003 at the age of 87, never prosecuted, never held accountable, never publicly confronted with what he had done. The secret seemed safe. And then in 2010, a medical historian named Susan Reverby was researching the Tuskegee experiment when she came across a box of old files in a university archive. Inside those files, she found the complete records of the Guatemala experiments. Detailed reports written by John Cutler himself describing exactly what had been done to the Guatemalan victims, the methods used, the number of people infected, the results obtained, everything, documented in Cutler's own handwriting. After 62 years of silence, the truth was finally out. Susan Reverby immediately understood the significance of what she had found. She contacted American government officials and bioethics experts. The response was swift. The Obama administration launched an immediate investigation. A presidential commission was established to review the full extent of the experiments. What they found confirmed everything in Cutler's files. Between 1946 and 1948, American researchers had deliberately infected at least 720 Guatemalan citizens with syphilis and gonorrhea without their knowledge or consent. At least 83 of those people had died, though the true death toll was difficult to establish given the incomplete records. The commission also found that the researchers had been aware that what they were doing violated ethical standards, even by the standards of the 1940s. This was not ignorance, this was deliberate, calculated, and hidden. On October 1, 2010, President Barack Obama made a personal phone call to Guatemalan President Alvaro Colom. On that call, Obama apologized on behalf of the United States government for the experiments conducted on Guatemalan citizens between 1946 and 1948. Secretary of State Hillary Clinton and Health Secretary Kathleen Sebelius issued a joint statement calling the experiments clearly unethical. It was a historic moment. A sitting American president personally apologizing to a foreign leader for crimes committed by American researchers on that country's citizens over 60 years earlier. The Guatemalan government called for justice, for compensation, for accountability. A lawsuit was filed in American courts on behalf of the victims and their families. The American courts eventually dismissed the case, ruling that Guatemalan citizens could not sue the American government in American courts. The victims received an apology, but they never received justice. The victims of the Guatemala experiments are finally being remembered. In Guatemala, memorials have been held for the men, women, and children who were used as human guinea pigs by American researchers. The families of victims who are still alive have spoken publicly about what happened to their loved ones, about the suffering that was never explained, about the illnesses that were never properly treated, about the lives that were cut short or permanently damaged by what was done to them. Many of the victims were indigenous Guatemalans who already faced enormous discrimination and marginalization in their own society. They were chosen specifically because they were powerless, because their suffering would be invisible, because nobody would ask questions on their behalf. They deserved so much better. They deserved dignity. They deserved truth. And they deserved justice that never came. Experiments are not just a historical footnote. They are a warning about what happens when researchers are given access to powerless people and told that the ends justify the means. A warning about the dangers of secrecy in scientific research. A warning about the way that the most vulnerable members of society are consistently chosen as the victims of the worst abuses of power. The experiments led directly to significant reforms in international research ethics. New guidelines were established requiring informed consent for all medical research involving human subjects. New oversight mechanisms were put in place. New international agreements were signed. But the people of Guatemala who were infected and harmed and killed received none of these protections. They came too late. And the man responsible, John Charles Cutler, died honored and celebrated, never facing a single consequence for what he did in those Guatemalan prisons and mental hospitals in 1946. Some wrongs are never made right, but they must never be forgotten. The Guatemala syphilis experiments are not just a historical footnote. They are a warning about what happens when researchers are given access to powerless people and told that the ends justify the means. A warning about the dangers of secrecy in scientific research. A warning about the way that the most vulnerable members of society are consistently chosen as the victims of the worst abuses of power. The experiments led directly to significant reforms in international research ethics. New guidelines were established requiring informed consent for all medical research involving human subjects. New oversight mechanisms were put in place. New international agreements were signed. But the people of Guatemala who were infected and harmed and killed received none of these protections. They came too late. And the man responsible, John Charles Cutler, died honored and celebrated, never facing a single consequence for what he did in those Guatemalan prisons and mental hospitals in 1946. Some wrongs are never made right, but they must never be forgotten.